In this episode, we're going to talk about some tools you can use to shape your light. Now, when you're shooting a video, you can plop a light down in front of your subject with a softbox and call it good. And that can work. And if you're in a room where you already have some existing light, you could maybe make something that looks pretty good, but it can often be a little bit flat. So there are some things you can do to add a little bit more dimension to your lighting. Of course, that's using additional lights. So for example, here we have a light that's on the backdrop there, a little slash of light using barn doors, a very hard light with an aperture 120D. But you can also do other things. We've got a rim light that's kind of wrapping around the side of my face here, which adds more dimension to the overall shot. Versus, again, just a softbox, looks kind of flat. Now, it's 2020. There have been a ton of new camera announcements. I'm here as your friend to share with you some tough love. If you are considering buying a new camera, I would ask you to first consider, are you working with like two or maybe three crappy little $12 light stands? If so, you probably want to reevaluate where you're spending your money. You probably don't need that new camera if you've got something that's already, less than 3 years old as far as cameras are concerned. You really probably should start investing a little bit more in your lights and your light shaping tools and your grip gear too, the stuff that holds the lights. So let's talk about some of these tools for shaping the light. Obviously, you need stands, and if you're going to be using some of the things we talk about today, flags, bounce boards, diffusion, you're going to need things to hold those in place as well. So it's worth investing in some stands. And you don't have to go and get 64 Century stands or C stands. You can do with less than that, and you don't have to get C stands necessarily. In fact, let me just talk about a few things here, and then we'll talk about ways to rig them up. So first of all is diffusion. Diffusion is what you use to soften the light, and usually for a key light on a talking head video or an interview, you want a relatively soft light. So we're using here an Aperture 300X in an Aperture Light Dome 2 softbox, and that's our key light. That's the thing that's lighting the majority of my face here. The idea is that it wraps around the face a little bit, creates some modeling, gives your face a little bit more shape, and you want to experiment with that angle that you're using for the key light because it can really kind of change the way that the light falls across your face and what looks best for any particular face. So you really have to experiment with that. Move it around a little bit. Move it up a little bit, move it down a little bit. You generally want it a little bit above, looking down at the subject. That's just kind of, as humans, how we expect light to come from above a little bit. But experiment with what looks best for your particular subject. Now, diffusion. I want to talk about that. You can use a softbox. You can use other things to diffuse. Here, for example, we have a little diffusion panel that's made by a company called Smart Flags, and I'll talk more about those in a minute. But the idea is to soften the light. First, let me define soft light. Soft light is light where the transition from light to shadow has a little bit of a transition. It's not super duper abrupt. Hard light has a super abrupt change from shadow to light. So there's usually a little bit more of a gradient with soft light, and it wraps around people's faces or other objects. So that's a definition of soft light. Now, to make soft light, you don't just need diffusion. What you really need is diffusion relatively close to the subject. So the larger the size of whatever is emitting the light is to your subject, the softer the light will be. So, for example, this softbox here is about, I would say, almost a meter across, roughly, and it's about 1.5 meters from me. So that's just one example of how to get soft light. Now, so your tools here are, first of all, diffusion, but also getting that diffusion closer, and the size of the diffusion, the area of the diffusion is what defines how soft the light will be. So you can move your light in and out, you can move your diffusion closer, just barely out of frame, can make a really nice soft light as well. So keep that in mind, diffusion, soft light. Another way to soften the light is to actually bounce it off of something that will reflect the light back on your subject. And so here, for example, is a bounce board. It's just a white piece of, I think they call this chloroplast. This will just bounce the light back at your subject. Now, again, the bounce board becomes the light source, and the size of that bounce board and how close it is to your subject defines how soft it'll be. I like to use bounce a lot if I'm going to do some fill. So for example, if something's just looking a little too contrasty, I will use that near the camera, and I'll use one of these bounce boards like this, shoot a LED panel light up into it, and then the bounce board reflects that and brings it back in to fill in the shadows on the subject. I like to put it close to the camera because that prevents you from getting any sort of double shadow issues. It just brings up the shadows a little bit instead of creating another light source that's competing with the key light. And sometimes you get these kind of unusual double shadows. So obviously the fill light that you're bouncing off of that board, typically you're going to want that to be less intense than the key light, obviously. So once you put that near the camera, it does a really nice job of bringing that ambient level up of all those shadows. Now, another thing you can do to add interest is the position of the light. If I'm doing an interview where the subject is looking off camera a little bit, I like to put the light on the opposite side of the talent from the camera because it just looks more interesting. And that can be something that can be a really useful tool. So keep that in mind if you are doing that type of subject looking off camera type of interview. That can be a really effective look. Now, another important thing is you need to sometimes block light, prevent it from going places you do not want it. In this particular case, I'm using a softbox with a grid on it, and that grid keeps the light from spilling everywhere. In this particular shot, I'm using an LED panel light, which basically throws light everywhere. But what I've done instead is I'm shooting the light, first of all, through a piece of diffusion. And secondly, I'm using a flag to prevent it from falling on the background. And the reason I don't want it to fall on the background is because I want this slash of light with the dark to kind of be the prominent layer in the back, to add that dimension there. So if you don't use the flag, this is what it looks like. And if you do use the flag, you get a more contrasty background, which in this particular case is what I wanted. Now, there are a bunch of companies out there that make gear like this, bounce boards, flags, diffusion, things like that. For a lot of us, for example, a corporate video shooter, and I have to move everything around myself, I don't necessarily want to bring the really big stuff. I don't want to bring a 4x4 necessarily. I don't need a 4x4. And in fact, in a lot of the rooms that I'm shooting at the offices, I can't fit a 4x4. So I want something smaller than that. And so one thing to consider are these super flags here. This is from my friend. His name is Cameron Randall. He lives here in Utah nearby. He's actually been prototyping these. He gave me these almost 2 years ago now. And I've been working with him. He's been working on the prototypes, working on the materials, and kind of refining it a little over time. But they're relatively inexpensive. And what's cool about them too is you can use these little grip heads that fit on any sort of light stand. So you don't have to have a C-stand. You can put them on the lighter weight portable light stands. And then that allows you to position your flags and your diffusion and your bounce boards in any way you need to. So that's one of the other things about these tools, flags, diffusion, and bounce, is you really have to position them just right. It takes a lot of finessing to get the look you want exactly. And so having a grip head really makes that a lot easier, and especially a grip head that you can put on a lightweight stand. Now, if you don't want to do that, you can always just use poster board or foam core board that you can buy pretty much at any art supply store, craft store. And what this allows you to do, these are really good for bounce boards. You can also get black ones that make really nice negative fill. Negative fill is another thing. So just like the flag here, you can put negative fill on the side of somebody here if you want to pull the shadows down a little bit. It actually makes it so there's less light on that side of their face. So if you are having shooting in a place where there's lots of light and you want to pull it down on one side, you can use that black poster board or foam core to do that. Of course, you can buy the white poster board or foam core to bounce the light. Those are a little bit more difficult to position because you can't really, they're not just raw. You can't use them with a grip head, but you can just hang them from a light stand if you need to do that. So that's a good way to do it on the cheap. Another thing I really like is, coming from a photography background, those 5-in-1 photography reflectors. In the middle of them, in addition to using them as a reflector and a bounce board, in the middle, they have a scrim, which is basically some really nice diffusion. So I've used that a lot for my key lights to shoot the key light through this diffusion, and it just makes a beautiful, beautiful key light. Very soft, very flattering on most people's faces. So there are a few thoughts about how to add a little bit more dimension to your lighting for your videos. I hope that was helpful for you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave those down below. And if you've not already subscribed, make sure you do that, and we'll be sure to get you more great videos on how to improve your lighting and sound for video. Talk to you soon.